and you share what it is that you're doing with others, it's important to be able to have them understand all of the important bits and pieces that you are doing, especially when it comes to grant writing time. So today we will share with you some really great tools and tricks that you can call upon to be able to really, in simplistic forms, be able to take what you are doing and have others understand and value it as well. So for the next bit, what we're going to do is talk a bit about something called a value proposition, and we'll have you start to think about your research in terms of having a value proposition. We'll talk about actually how we go about formulating that. We'll talk about different types of communication and language that is used. I will show you how you can actually frame a value proposition that you can use in grant writing and just day-to-day, when people are asking you about your research and what it's all about. We will reveal a secret ingredient to communicating the value of your research. And then, as I mentioned, I will also share some additional tools and services that are available to you at the University of Guelph that you can take advantage of throughout your time here. So the first thing that I want people just to think about is the difference between what's considered an entrepreneur versus an intrapreneur. And just by a show of hands, is the term intrapreneur, is that something new to people? If that's kind of a new term, just you can do that little hand raise over at the top, because sometimes people haven't necessarily heard of the idea of being an intrapreneur. We're all very familiar with that entrepreneur. And certainly the concept of that entrepreneur is, being your own boss. You have more freedom, although I know for a fact that if I asked quite a few entrepreneurs, they would question that, whether or not they have a lot of freedom, because it certainly does take a lot of work. Definitely more risk is involved when you are your own boss, being that versus the intrapreneur. And the intrapreneur is kind of, how you could see yourself when you're associated with an organization like the university, for example, or when you're part of an organization and working within that. There might be a little bit less freedom, but you still have the ability to, take ideas and kind of run with them. So we like to think of people kind of at the university almost as an intrapreneur, because you're doing things, but you're kind of under this umbrella of the university that allows you to use a lot of the neat tools and services in order to become, your own person, more to speak, with your research. So what we like to do is we like to take some of those entrepreneurial principles that are beneficial and be able to take them and actually how we can tweak them here and there to be able to use them for people that are actually more of an intrapreneur. So what we're going to do over the next few minutes is actually take some of those tools and how they can be applied to you and your research. And as I mentioned before, we will be talking at the end of the session about a secret ingredient that we will reveal as we go through this. So what I want people to do just for a moment is take off your academic hats, which I know many of you are used to being in that world of academia. And we're actually going to think for a bit more like an entrepreneur or a marketer. And we're going to be talking about the value of your specific research. So this term value proposition, again, show of hands, is there anybody that has not heard of the term value proposition? Is this something new to people? No, I'm not seeing a lot of hands, so maybe it's not necessarily a new concept, but maybe how you can actually use value proposition might not necessarily be as well known. So when we talk about a value proposition, it is the promised benefit to be delivered, and it represents the primary reason for your work. Okay. And when we talk about that promised benefit, we mean, what does the research offer the world? So what does your research offer people as a benefit, for example? And then looking at the primary reason for your work, what is the why behind why you are doing your research? So what problem does your research perhaps solve in the real world? So for example, if you're doing grant applications, your value proposition would be your core driver for doing your research, and it would really highlight why your idea would be funded instead of another project. So that's where you want to make sure that as you go through your various components of your research, you're always keeping that why and the promised benefit and the primary reason really top of mind, so that you have a nice, clear value proposition as you move forward and communicate what it is that you're doing. So if we look at value proposition definitions, they're a little bit different depending on what we're using them for. So for a product that might be coming to market, it would be a clear statement that explains, how this specific problem would solve a customer's dilemma. It would tell their ideal customer why they would buy from you and not from your competition, for example. And it tends to be more of a fixed part of a positioning statement. And we'll talk a little bit about positioning statements a little bit later. For a brand, a company will make many different products, but a lot of brands will actually have an overarching value proposition that organizes all of their business activities. So if we look at this from an academic perspective, so if you're a researcher, you're still going to have a nice clear statement that would explain how your work advances science and understanding in your area of expertise. And the benefit to this is it tells other scholars, potential grad students, or funding bodies and partners why they would want to pay attention to your work and or potentially work with you. And then, you're going to have, again, multiple potential projects. And for every one of those projects, you're still going to have kind of this overarching value proposition, and it might be different depending on whatever project you're working on. So if we look at University of Guelph, what would you say is Guelph's value proposition? Is there anything that comes to mind? It can be just a couple words even that would come to mind. If you want to share in the chat section, feel free to put something there. When you think of University of Guelph from your perspective, what is the university's value proposition? Does anybody have anything that they'd like to share on that? No, we're all just soaking it in. That's okay. So when I look at the University of Guelph, and I look at the different areas that Guelph is kind of known for, depending on what area of expertise you're looking at, you're going to see a different value proposition. So depending on, if you're within the veterinary area, you're going to see University of Guelph as Canada's veterinary leader, for example. If you are more in food science, you're going to look and you're going to see it as Canada's Food University. Depending on where you're coming from, you're potentially going to look and see a specific product or research from a different vantage point. You can actually potentially see different value propositions. And this is a really great tool. So this tool is called a Value Proposition Canvas, and it was developed by Dr. Alexander Osterwalder. And really what it is it's a framework to ensure that there's a fit between a product and the market that this product might be in. So what we have here on the left is we have the value proposition. So for example, this is where you might fill in the various parts. So why you, what about you makes you a good fit for maybe a grant application, for example. So, your expertise in your area of research, your gain creators would be the benefits that you would bring to, whatever it is that the funding body on the right would be looking for. And then the pain relievers are things that would more or less address, I'm going to say, the pains on the right, which would be whatever your funding body or whoever that is on your right is looking for. And so you have a good fit when each of these sides kind of address each other and when they coincide. And so it's a really good tool to be able to use, to be able to see whether or not there is a good fit when you're thinking about grant applications, when you're thinking about collaborations, and that kind of thing. So I just wanted to mention that because we will use that a little bit later when we look at an example. So the next step is to actually formulate a value proposition. And so in formulating our value proposition, we want to make sure that it is done so in a really clear and plain language. And I want to start off with the quote from Albert Einstein: "If you can't explain it simply, you don't understand it well enough." And this is a really good quote because clear language is a process of explaining concepts simply. And sometimes the process of writing in clear language really helps to clarify the content that you're trying to share, and it really can help narrow the focus of your message. So, for example, we have different types of what we consider persuasive communication. And I don't know if people have heard of this before, persuasive communication, but we have logos. So that appeals to our logic and reason. We have pathos, which appeals to our emotions and values. And we have ethos that appeals to our credibility and trust. And so when we look at these three different types of communication and how we use them, classically with academia, we're very used to using this type of communication where we would, if we're trying to, persuade somebody something, we would start off by giving a lot of background information. So we would be, looking at that using logos. We'd be trying to appeal to people's logic and reason to get them to understand maybe why it is that we'd be doing something. Then we would follow up with some ethos, which would be to appeal to credibility and trust. We would give all of those supporting details. So perhaps we would explain why our expertise in this area is, warranted. We would talk a lot about having really good referencing to all of our details that we're talking about to be able to support our argument. And then we would start to funnel down to results. But we want to stop there because really, when we look at the academic way of communicating, it's not necessarily very high impact. And so when we talk about having and creating a value proposition, we want it to be very high impact, which just means that we want to really right off the bat, grab somebody and get their attention. So instead, what we recommend using is something called collaborative communication. And this is where we take that triangle and we really flip it upside down. And instead of starting off with all that background research and the, supporting documents, documentation, etc., we jump right into the why, and we want to appeal to emotion and values. So we start off with that pathos type of persuasive communication, followed by then the ethos, which is again appealing to that credibility and trust, and then appeal to logic and reason, which is kind of the last part of our communication. So that is definitely considered to be more of a high impact type of communication, and that's something that we want to keep in mind again. Okay, we have a question here. I think the why me part is quite challenging. I have to work on a similar topic related to my project application, but so do other researchers. Do you have some examples on how to write this part in the application? Thank you. Yes, certainly, I can provide some information for you. We can maybe talk a little bit about this. Is it Nanny? Is that correct? We can talk a little bit about this after, because yeah, it's very challenging sometimes to get that why right off the bat. And so that's why I feel like when we go through some of the next few tools, you might be able to have an easier go of surfacing that why right up to the top. So let's just hold on to that question. It's a great question, just for a moment, and we'll see whether or not we can sort that out as we go through some of the other tools that might be able to help you. So when we talk a little bit about clear language, what do we mean by this? Well, certainly there's a lot of different definitions for clear language, but certainly what we want to focus on is really using nice, clear, simple, and concise language. And, you know, it's not necessarily rules, but it's more of an approach. So you want to make sure that, you know, simple is always better. So whenever you have things that you've written out, edit them down as much as possible, have other people look at them and give their input. And sometimes that is the best way to try and eventually get it so that you have a very, very simple message. Certainly what clear language is definitely not dumbing down your message or oversimplifying. It's certainly not patronizing to your audience, even though sometimes when you're in a certain field and you want to use a lot of, you know, familiar jargon to your area of expertise, etc., and you're not using that, you might be thinking, well, is this actually still conveying my message? It certainly is. You're not removing any of the necessary content that is important to get across. And the only thing that you're really taking away is the complexity or potentially obscurity for people that might not be familiar with your area of expertise. And again, when we talk about communicating the value of our research, we are often communicating this to people that don't necessarily have a background in your area. So people that are doing grant writing, taking the applications, etc. They may not necessarily understand a lot of the jargon that you would be using on a daily basis. And it's because you've been in this area for a while, so you start to really understand this, whereas they may not have that understanding. So it is really important to try and keep our messages very simple and use uncomplicated terms. And then the other thing to just remember is that actually clear and plain language writing can sometimes take about 50% longer to actually write than just going and writing something that you normally would write in your research area. So it can be a bit challenging for sure. I also just want to touch on literacy, because literacy again is the ability to understand and use printed information in daily activities. So it's not necessarily just that the understanding is there, it's also being able to use that information. So for example, we have different levels in Canada. So level 1, for example, would be able to, someone would be able to make sense of a bus station schedule. Level 2, would be limited reading skills. They would be, having to follow instructions on a label or directions, for example, for cooking. Level 3 would be minimum required for literacy for life and work. So looking at things like a job application, understanding how to complete that or what would be asked. And then levels 4 and 5 would be higher level integration and interpretation synthesis skills, where, it's definitely at that higher end. And so when we're talking about communicating your research, we want to be always aiming at around a level 3. So for example, somebody that might be in grade 6 or 7 would be able to make sense of this. So that's always a good test as well, is when you're creating some of your communications for your research. If you have a 11 or 12-year-old around, asking them if they could read it and understand it. And if they can, then you're definitely on the right track. Avoiding jargon, and I did mention that earlier. And so avoiding jargon, this is an example of, we all speak in jargon, and especially when we are in specific areas. I know I have had several jobs in the past where the first few staff meetings that I participate in, I'm always just writing down all of these acronyms and things, trying to understand what the heck is going on, because we get very used to speaking in jargon and using acronyms for things that we're familiar with. And so again, making sure that you don't use these types of jargon. So I have 2 examples here. So the first one, participants read assertions whose veracity was either affirmed or denied by the subsequent presentation of an assessment word, is our first example of jargon. The second is, the researcher investigated the phenotypic properties of an analogous poultry ovum. And so if we kind of take away the jargon and change that just to clear, plain language, this is what we would end up with. So instead, for the first sentence, we could say that participants read sentences, each followed by the word true or false. And the second example, the researchers studied turkey and chicken eggs. So definitely a lot more clear and concise, and definitely relevant to a lot more people. So try to avoid that jargon if possible. In the passive voice, you know, when we talk about this, and I'm sure maybe even people have been have come across this with resume writing is another example where this is definitely stressed. Trying to use an active voice in your writing versus a passive voice, where the subject of the sentence is acted upon by the verb. So the television was watched by Peter, the letters were delivered by the courier, the regulations were proposed. So if we change that to more of an active voice, we have Peter watched the television, the courier delivered the letters, and we proposed new regulations. So just small changes, and you've gone from sounding passive to more of an active form. The other thing is changing verbs into nouns. So we have here, we are responsible for management of the program. An analysis of the data was performed by the project. Instead, how about just saying we manage the program, or the project team analyzed the data, right? And sometimes when we see that, then we understand a little bit. We go, oh yeah, okay, we didn't have to say all of those words. Because the other thing is, you'll notice, is often by doing some of these small changes, they're actually shortening the sentence as well. And sometimes, again, you're trying to keep things as succinct and concise as possible. Avoiding double negatives. So he was not absent. The procedure will not be ineffective. It was never illegitimate. Anybody want to take a crack at, you know, writing how you would avoid using a double negative here in the chat? What about he was not absent? What could you write instead? Oh, Kelly. He was present. Exactly. Yes. Yes. What about the next one? The procedure will not be ineffective. Anyone? Oh, that's okay. The procedure will be effective. Yes, excellent. Will be effective. So again, it was never illegitimate. It was legitimate. So, you know, just again, having a second look at some of your writing and making it a little bit more concise. So what I have here is a little value proposition table, and this is where I think for Nari, this might even help you a little bit with when coming up with your why. And so this is a nice table, and the example that we're using is an Uber example. So again, we're looking at as a more of a product marketing example, but again, can be used for anything. So what we want to do is we want to set up along the top, we have kind of who our target audience is, or who it is that we're doing this research for. And then down on the left-hand side, we have, you know, before our research would be implemented and then after. So if we were to fill this in for Uber, for example, we would have, before Uber came along, we had long waits for taxis, unpleasant experiences. We often didn't know how much things were going to cost us. And, you know, consumers felt irritated, insecure. They were frustrated by public transit. And then Uber came along, and all of a sudden now you have access to rides when you want them, clean cars, cordial drivers, and a schedule that you had more control over. So then, as a result of that, consumers felt more in control. They felt secure and appreciated, and certainly were confident about their time and cost now. So there, you know, you can kind of just see right off the bat a little bit of the why and what it is, or what the value is that Uber was bringing forward to consumers. So that is the foundation of being able to develop a little bit of the why along why, you know, for example, your research might happen, or if it's a product, why you would want to develop a specific product. Another example, so this one we're looking at wireless insulin pumps. And again, across the top, we have patients who are our target audience for this. And so before we had, you know, patients with inconsistent blood sugar levels, they needed to carry around these test kits. They had scheduling issues. They often had to leave meetings and gatherings to take their medicine. They were often very worried. You know, energy and mood levels were not consistent. They felt pressured to remember everything, and obviously very singled out if you're having to get up and leave meetings, etc. So after these wireless insulin pumps were implemented, we have more consistent blood sugar levels. We have better mood and energy. We have people who feel less encumbered by having to carry the supplies around. And in general, they're just much more productive. They feel much more like everyone else. So again, starting to understand the why a little bit of, you know, if you were somebody developing the wireless insulin pump, your why becomes a little bit more evident. I want to just take an example from the summer here. This was a grant that was put out on cannabis and mental health. And so just as an example, I want to take you through something, you know, so for example, if we had a product that was going to be a tool that we could, you know, identify people who are self-medicating with cannabis in doctors' offices, you know, this is kind of what we would do in order to set that up. Again, we would look at the situation before. And so we have our ADHD and anxiety sufferers before. They would have unsatisfactory medical therapy options. They would have symptoms that limited their ability to enjoy life. They felt underserved and left out of the healthcare system. And then after this tool was implemented, we have more empathetic care from doctors. We have better dialogue with their healthcare practitioners because of this tool now. There are more coping strategies and treatments available. And as a result, these people would feel more encouraged, hopeful, and healthier and happier. So what I'm going to suggest, and we won't do it as today as a group, but you will have this tool to be able to practice your research and take it and be able to kind of start to tease out a little bit of that value or the why that we talked about in having that high impact communication. And so, you know, we will share this presentation with you and you can have a look at this tool, and then we'll also share a few other tools as well. Let's see. So if we looked back and we took our value proposition canvas, again, to look at fit for whatever it is in the market that we're trying to appease, and we were to put in our from our cannabis tool, we would, you know, why us? Well, we are the subject matter expert affiliated with a respected institution, and that would kind of probably be what you would be putting in your area for your research as well. For our pain relievers, we would have a new diagnostic tool and rubric to use to identify non-recreational cannabis users. And if we look at the right-hand side and we look at the pains that these people are undergoing, we have ADHD and anxiety sufferers. They lack options for controlling their mental health problems. And if we look at the gain creators on the left for our value proposition, we have literature review interviews with mental health patients and associations and model creation and validation. So we have things that actually would address the pains, which is one of the key things that you want to be looking at to see if there's a fit with this, depending on what it is that you're trying to fit within, whether or not it's a grant application, whether or not it's, you know, just something that you're trying to address that exists in real world life. That's kind of how you are able to justify your research as addressing that problem. Okay, and so then we want to take this actually and frame our value proposition. So when we are writing a value proposition statement, what we want to do with this is we want to be able to identify what group or community cares about this problem. So again, what does your research have to, you know, why does the outside world care about what's going on with your research? What service your research will or may deliver, how you will deliver it, and why you are delivering it. Again, and that's going back to that, why are you the expert that people would care about? So some of the top tips for framing your value proposition, you definitely want to highlight the enormity of the problem you're tackling. And again, this also helps to share, to kind of go along with that, teasing out that why. Again, why is your research important and what is it addressing? It tells the reviewer upfront what your research hopes to accomplish. You're distilling the benefit down to an easy to comprehend, clear language sentence. And you're establishing your credibility by sharing a description of the work you've done before that makes your team the perfect choice for solving this problem. So this is kind of our template. This is our template for you to create a very clear and concise value proposition. So we have 4, and I'm going to use the example again from our cannabis example of our tool that we developed. So we would say it's 4 doctors who struggle to identify patients who use cannabis to self-medicate. Our research on anxiety and ADHD will provide tools and insights that will help them provide better care for their patients. And so that's kind of our proposition statement. And that is just a very, simple, using plain language, concise sentence that conveys the importance of our research, or whatever it is that we are doing. And again, so I won't necessarily take the time today to have everyone go through this, but this is exactly the template that we recommend that you use in order to create that value proposition statement. And of course, once you have your statement, you want to just make sure that that it is what it needs to be. We need it to be short, specific, makes the reader or listener want to know more, and written in accessible language. And again, these value proposition statements are really, really important when it comes to grant application writing. And you'll find that when you have these statements and they're clear, you can kind of inject them into your grant proposal in various ways that, aren't necessarily repetitive, but just kind of keep that important point of, again, why you're the expert and why your research matters in addressing whatever problem that they're trying to fund. The other thing just to keep in mind a little bit is, that differentiation. And, you may be doing similar research to other people, but what is it about your research that is unique? And I like to use this diagram because I think it's really quite interesting, because the person on the left, certainly, you've got your lemonade, 20 cents a glass. The person on the right has just gone that one step further, and just by using and honing in on some of the perhaps trends of the time, has simply said lemonade cleanse, same price, etc., but just because of the wording and the relevancy to today's market, you see that obviously that has people's attention a little bit more. So again, just trying to think of, what you can come up with that makes you a little bit different. And so earlier on, when we were chatting, I talked a bit about the secret ingredient. And so the secret ingredient, although it doesn't necessarily, it's not probably very obvious to you, but when you think about the different ways of that persuasive communication, the one thing that really comes to mind is that pathos or that empathy. And really, when we think about empathy and trying to inject that empathy into whatever it is around your why, it is the capacity to understand or feel what another person is experiencing from within their frame of reference. That is the capacity to place oneself in another's position. And so just keeping in mind the idea of empathy certainly just makes your, anytime that you can have someone have an emotional response to something, when you are writing, whether or not you're communicating, you're certainly going to have a higher impact than if you do not have that empathetic feel. And that's where really having that why up front is helpful. And so hopefully some of the tools that I've suggested today will really help you in being able to think about that why and be able to bring it to the surface of your communication with your research. So for the takeaways for today, things to keep top of mind, communicating the value of your research is very important. Your research is very important, but if it can't be communicated in a high impact way, it's not necessarily going to, be to the level that you need it to be at. Oops. You should be able to communicate whatever it is you're doing in short, succinct, easy to understand statement. And so I've given you those tools that hopefully you can literally start plugging in and fill in the blank and come up with a nice, easy statement. Almost, I would call it almost a small elevator pitch. Try to use plain language. And again, could a child understand it? Revisit this whenever you're applying to grants or presenting your research. So, always be kind of thinking about the why and trying to keep this top of mind whenever it is that you are doing grant applications, etc. And then always trying to keep in mind what makes your research unique or why it is that you doing this research is unique. And then the last, of course, part is, does it invoke that empathy or that emotional response? All right, so just before I go over a few more of the services that are available at the Research Innovation Office, is there any questions that people have for me? Nanny, did that help you at all with your coming up with your why, looking at those tools that exist? Excellent. Well, feel free to reach out if you need help. And at the end of this, I'm also going to provide, a contact at the Research Innovation Office. Dana, she's very happy to speak to people and help them craft their why, certainly, because it is something I think the more you do it, the better you get at it for sure. So thanks everyone for listening. I do want to just share a few things that the Research Innovation Office offers. So obviously our Advantage workshops, you're participating in one today, and they happen kind of throughout the year. They help with winning those grants. If you have collaborations that you're trying to work with or partnerships, mobilizing teams, improving team dynamics, communicating effectively. We have, these are the basic, background, I want to say, thoughts around the different 5 that are offered, but sometimes they're slightly called different things. I know I'm doing another one in January, and then I think there's another one coming up in February. We're looking at collaboration techniques and knowledge mobilization. So certainly keep an eye on the event calendar at the Research Innovation Office to see when these are available to you. And then, of course, this is just the various areas within the Research Innovation Office that they offer different types of tools and resources within. So obviously collaboration, commercialization, being able to actually have people realize the full impact of your work, starting and scaling a business. And then, this is just the evolving history of support for the Research Innovation Office. So looking at technology transfer, industry liaison, new venture creation, and knowledge mobilization, which is a newer area. But like I said before, they have a lot of fantastic tools and resources. They have an industry liaison team that works to form strategic partnerships with industry, really well connected, navigating all of those non-disclosure and legal agreements around property ownership, being able to identify funding opportunities, and then of course those good old grants and grant applications. So a lot of support there. There's also a fantastic guide to research partnerships with the University of Guelph that's available. You can check out on the Research Innovation Office website. Technology transfer specialists that help with any sort of invention disclosures, looking at patents, market plans to support licensing, negotiation supports, and agreements. So, and then of course, knowledge mobilization officers, looking at, again, research grants and proposals, facilitating the exchange of knowledge with decision makers in government, and being able to take those technical terms and complex science and being able to make those into those clear language sentences a little bit that we talked about earlier on. And then the new venture creation, which is again really supporting researchers to take their ideas and make them happen in the marketplace, which is pretty amazing. And then these are all the different areas of supports on their pathway to commercialization, from that very beginning discovery research all the way up to venture investment and scale. So this is Dana Mccauley's name. She is the director of the New Venture Creation Office, and I know that she loves to hear from people. Again, helping you come up with your why, for example. So feel free to reach out to Dana if you have any questions, or anyone at the Research Innovation Office at the University of Guelph. So thanks everyone for participating in today's workshop. I hope that you will be able to take 1 or 2 ideas at least and be able to take those tools and start thinking a little bit about how your research can be, really dynamic and have that high impact when you are communicating it and, applying to grants and things like that, and help you win some fantastic grants. So everyone, I hope you have a wonderful rest of your week, and look forward to maybe seeing you at another Advantage workshop.
Thanks very much.
All right, thanks, Kelly. Have a good day, everyone.
Bye, everyone.